Days before nuclear talks between Iran and the P5+1 resume in Geneva, it's still hard to say whether a deal is close at hand. US lawmakers are discussing new sanctions, and American delegates in Israel say they want to assure Tel Aviv that its demands are met. Well, why does the US Congress seek to impose additional sanctions on Iran while Tehran has taken confidence-building measures to resolve differences over its nuclear program? Is it trying to sabotage a possible deal, and why? This is the debate.
3 days of talks between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany ended in Geneva on Saturday. Although the two sides managed to make significant progress and narrow their differences, as is stated by the Western side, a final agreement was not reached after France blocked the deal with its foreign minister, Laurent Fabius, saying Israel's concerns should be taken into consideration. The two sides have agreed to meet again on November 20th. Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu has all the while been fuming over a possible deal, calling on the US and the EU not to let up their sanctions on Tehran. Reacting to Netanyahu's anger, the Swedish foreign minister wrote on his Twitter account,
"Somewhat strange that Israeli PM Netanyahu is able to condemn the possible deal with Iran as bad, even before it has been done. Irrational that Israel is trying to block efforts to reach a reasonable deal with Iran on nuclear issue."
Only a day after the end of talks in Geneva, US lawmakers said they wanted to tighten sanctions on Iran in an attempt to prevent President Barack Obama from what they call giving away too much in dealing with Iran.
"We know the sanctions have gotten us here, and we're worried we're dealing away our leverage."
The remarks by the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee were also echoed by Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, one of the main architects of Washington's sanctions against Iran. This antagonistic stance was also there in the run-up to the Geneva talks. Right on the eve of the negotiations, Corker announced plans to bar the Obama administration from using the waivers that are currently on the books to create limited exemptions to the sanctions program. The new plan, if implemented, could throw a wrench into the administration's plans to use incremental confidence-building measures, including some sanctions relief for Iran, as a means of continuing the nuclear negotiations. Obama would then have to use his veto power to use the waivers, which would in turn entail political confrontation with his opponents. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has also said lawmakers from both parties will soon introduce a resolution that would ask Iran to shut down its uranium enrichment program altogether and dismantle its work in centrifuges. This is based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has the right to have its own peaceful nuclear enrichment program. Tehran says enrichment right is its red line. Meanwhile, on Monday, Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency agreed on a roadmap for cooperation. Based on the agreement, Iran will voluntarily allow the agency's inspectors to visit its Arak heavy water facility and the Gachin mine. Head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Ali Akbar Salehi, says the 3-month agreement is part of Tehran's policy for more cooperation with the IAEA.
This is a very timely and positive development that shows substantial progress and should be hailed by those Western powers and others involved in the multilateral negotiations with Iran.
Why do the US lawmakers try to sabotage the hopes of a deal? Are they trying to curry favor with Israel? The West has been campaigning against Iran's nuclear program, saying it wants to make sure Tehran does not develop nuclear weapons. Now, with Tehran's show of determination in talks on the one hand, and the US threats of even more sanctions on the other, it becomes evident that the nuclear issue is only an excuse for hawkish politicians and lobbyists in the US to pursue their anti-Iran hostile policies in line with those of the Israeli regime.
You're watching The Debate. Joining me now live from Washington is Mr. Richard Weitz. He's the Director of Program Management at the Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for being with us, sir. And a warm welcome to our guest here in Tehran with the University of Tehran, Mr. Mohammad Marandi. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being on this edition of The Debate. I'll start my first question with our guest in Washington, Mr. Weitz. A senior U.S. delegation has reassured Israelis that any nuclear deal with Iran would include the freezing of work at the heavy water reactor in the central city of Arak here in Iran. Now, isn't this, do you think, breaking ranks with the P5+1 group in a sense, and a sign that parties from outside the group, particularly Israel, are attempting to take the reins here? And is that in any way helpful?
Well, I think Israel's not alone. I mean, there are a bunch of parties who are trying to come in and say that we need to make sure to deal with, Iranian activities in Afghanistan. I've heard that. I heard in Lebanon. There are others who say that want the West to relent, saying that this is a great time to make a deal and we shouldn't pose any obstacles that might wreck that opportunity. So I'm not especially surprised that Israel's trying to influence the negotiations. I suspect Israel's influence is probably greater than many, but I know that there are other actors that are also have much influence. And Israel's not a member of the P5+1, so it can only use indirect means to try and influence any settlement.
Well, Mr. Marandi, before we discuss the attempt by U.S. lawmakers for further sanctions, first we'll focus on Israel. Do you think that Israel is indirectly influencing the talks, but this is nothing to be particularly concerned about because it's not a member of the P5+1?
Well, the Israeli regime definitely has a very important role to play in the sense that it influences policy making in the United States. It is highly influential at all levels of power in that country. And as we've seen during the negotiations, the French foreign minister also spoke about Israeli interests and how they have to be taken into account. These, of course, are detrimental to Western interests because at the end of the day, if Western countries want to ease their tensions with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the only way forward is to find a solution to the nuclear issue where the Iranians their rights to have peaceful nuclear energy are accepted to the full degree, meaning the whole of the NPT and Iran's rights within the NPT are accepted.
Yes.
And in addition, all the sanctions are lifted, whereas the Iranians in return are completely open and leave no room for any ambiguity and resolve any questions that Western powers basically may have. That is basically what the deal is supposed to be. If there is a deal that could ease tensions throughout the region, throughout the middle of West Asia and North Africa, if not, then the United States and Western Europe are facing a deteriorating situation throughout the region, and this will only further destabilize the region as a whole.
Well, of course, I'll put this question to Mr. Weitz now in Washington. Everyone is saying that reaching a deal is going to be helpful at this situation. Now is the time to use this opportunity. But Mr. Weitz, we're not seeing, according to a lot of analysts, a clear approach from the United States. We're seeing John Kerry, for instance, in Geneva. He wasn't the one who mentioned Israel. It was rather France who mentioned Israel. And people were thinking it looks like the United States actually this time going for a deal. And now we've got US lawmakers saying that we have to impose further sanctions. Now, this kind of talk, do you think, is it going to lead to a deal? Is there division between the US Congress, lawmakers, and the White House?
I'm surprised that you even are not expecting a positive answer to that one. I mean, I think it's obvious that there's always been divisions between members of the executive and Congress, members within Congress, political divisions. This is nothing new. We saw this in the case of Syria. We've seen this in earlier Iranian issues.
But are they, Mr. Weitz, tying the hand of President Barack Obama?
Well, to some extent. However, President Obama has considerable leeway in what kind of sanctions he could relax As your viewers will recall, we have basically three types of measures being imposed on Iran. They're the UN sanctions, which are voted upon by all the members of the Security Council that have veto power, and that would require them all to rescind those. There are unilateral U.S. sanctions that have been adopted by the American Congress. So there's the Iran Sanctions Act. Sometimes it's Iran and Syria, sometimes it's Iran and some other country, but basically it's imposing various sanctions. And then there are these measures the executive branch has taken on its own, either by executive order or most commonly in recent years by sending people from the Treasury and State Department off to India, to Korea, Japan, where have you, and tell them they've got to cut back on their economic ties with Iran. You could easily reverse that latter category. If President Obama is comfortable with an agreement that he has with the Iranian government, he would just tell people, stop, you can go ahead and trade with Iran, stop sending out the Treasury, stop enforcing some of the unilateral measures. Repealing the congressional ones are harder. He would need the support of Congress. The UN sanctions, of course, would need the support of France and other countries. But he has considerable leeway because there are just so many sanctions on Iran that there are plenty that he can pull away as we see some progress.
Well, the thing is, I'll put this one to Mr. Marandi. The thing is, we're hearing now U.S. lawmakers, Mr. Marandi, speaking of imposing sanctions that remove those waivers for President Obama, leaving him with only one option if he wants to oppose those sanctions, and that's his veto option. So would you say that Congress, the Senate, are actually trying to tie President Barack Obama's hands here? And why should they, specifically at this time, right now, talk about additional sanctions on Tehran and pressure on Tehran?
Well, there are two things really. One is that if the president wants this to be passed as law, then it shows that Congress and the president are united when it comes to Iran. If the president is opposed and it is still passed into law, then it shows the United States has a very weak president, and that questions his ability to lead any negotiations with Iran, and thus raising the question, is it of any use to talk to the United States? Most of the sanctions are the sanctions that have been passed into law by the United States. They are, of course, against international law. The sanctions that are beyond the scope of Congress are very minute in comparison. And even if the U.S. president was to ignore them, if that was possible, some of them to a degree he has leeway, and in other cases he doesn't, still companies would not be, for example, get involved in importing or exporting medicine to or for Iran because they would be afraid that, let's say, after 6 months or after a new president comes to power, they may get into legal trouble. So it's not going to change the reality on the ground. Another point is that it's not even clear with regard what the U.S. position is at the negotiating table, because almost all the reporters and diplomats were saying that there were major differences between France and the United States, and then the U.S. Secretary of State goes on and says, we are one and the same. So I think, again, that raises questions about the competence of the Americans at the negotiating table. If when the Iranians speak to the U.S. Secretary of State, can they trust him can they trust what he says? Yes. Or is it basically, is he saying one thing at the negotiating table and saying something somewhere else? Yes,
and that is a major question, Mr. Weitz. Do you think that Iran can trust what John Kerry says at the negotiating table when we're seeing these kinds of remarks by Kerry? I mean, after the negotiations, everyone, diplomats, Iran's foreign minister, and reports were saying that this time round, Iran was prepared for a deal. It was the P5+1 who had divisions. Now we're hearing John Kerry say that, no, we were united.
I think that it would be I'd be surprised if Kerry were to say anything else. I mean, he wouldn't start attacking France as being the holdup. But the main emphasis is not that, hey, Iran has now sabotaged negotiations, we're not seeing any progress. The main message is we're almost there, we have some more details we need to finalize. He expects that we will be able to do this in the next month. So it's a much more positive message.
Sorry for jumping in, Mr. White.
Discourse is making it sound.
John Kerry has also said that it was Iran who didn't accept the deal. I mean, are these kinds of comments conducive? Are they going to help? Or they're just going to leave Iran with questions about what Washington's policy actually is?
Well, do we know that Iran, when confronted by the demands of France, didn't say no? They probably did, and that's probably where that line is coming from.
Okay. Now, one thing that I just want to raise here to both of you, and I'll start with our guest in Washington, Mr. White, is a lot of people are saying that this round of negotiations, what was important in it was for the P5+1 to offer an easing of sanctions for Iran to reach a compromise or an agreement, Iran giving some concessions and the West giving some concessions. But at the same time, when we're seeing talk of even additional sanctions, or when we're seeing, for instance, Wendy Sherman saying in her visit to Israel that even if a deal is made, we're going to put the sanctions still on Iran, especially on the oil and banking sector. Isn't this giving mixed signals to Iran? Isn't it just putting the whole negotiating issue under a question mark?
I think that the Iranian officials are smart enough to understand that the sanction relief will probably not be from the U.S. sanctions, which have been so long, and Iran doesn't really need. I mean, it'd be helpful, but I think Iran was probably much more interested in being able to have normal or close to normal trade relations with Japan, with South Korea, with Turkey, with perhaps some European countries. I think that's where, if I were an Iranian policymaker looking for the next few years at least, I would see opportunities to break out of the economic problems I've been having. The Americans are going to be too hard for the reasons we discussed. There's just too many people in Congress who would try and block them. So I think that Iran and the Western negotiators should think about how Iran can benefit from relaxation of the non-American sanctions, and that can be, I think, very considerable.
Well, those who are speaking of sanctions, Mr. Marandi, are the ones who say we are concerned about Iran's intentions, we can't trust Iran. What do you think Iran hasn't done to win that trust? Today we heard Iran and the IAEA reaching an agreement, and Iran was saying, I'm ready to allow IAEA inspectors to come and visit the Arak facility. What else do you think the other side wants from Iran in terms of transparency?
Well, I think the major problem, first of all, is that in the West, they have a serious problem with regards to their mentality towards Iran. For example, earlier on when Wendy Sherman said that basically that dishonesty is in the DNA of the Iranians, that was seen by many in Iran to be outrageous. Or when Kerry, on the one hand, says that we were united and then places the blame to any failure at the negotiating table on the Iranians. Again, the Iranians see this deception, which is supposedly in the DNA of the Iranians, really stemming from American politicians. It makes negotiating with the United States all the more difficult. But at the end of the day, I think that the very fact that the Iranians are negotiating has had very positive results already. There is a possibility that there may be some progress in the future talks. The Iranians have already shown their goodwill, both in today's negotiations, as you pointed out, with the IAEA, and the Iranians being more open than in the past, despite the fact that the flexibility that the Iranians are showing right now goes far beyond its duty as a member of the NPT. For example, as you pointed out, with the Arak heavy water nuclear center. So, but the benefits, I think, is that if there is a breakthrough, then it is good news for everyone. But if there isn't a breakthrough, I think And I'm not speaking about a short-term breakthrough, a 6-month breakthrough. I mean, because this would be a minor breakthrough. I mean, a real breakthrough in the whole issue. If there isn't, then it shows that really the United States is the one that is impeding progress. It shows both to the Iranian people and also the international community.
That brings me to the next question. Mr. Weitz, we know that during the previous round of talks, when Iran didn't have this new administration, the P5+1 side was saying the onus is now on Iran. Now, with Iran showing more flexibility and transparency, we're seeing even France saying today that they're not far from reaching an agreement. So why do you think there's still talk of pressure on Tehran and sanctions on Tehran? We had the leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution saying this shows that the nuclear issue is not the issue here, that they're just looking for excuses to impose pressure on Tehran. If it wasn't the nuclear issue, he said, it's going to be human rights, it's going to be Iran's missiles, etc.
There are some, I won't lie to you, there are some people who have that position. It tends to go back to what happened with the American hostages and that whole affair. And there are others who are very concerned about Israel's security, what have you. But there are many groups that are weighing the cost of benefits of any kind of agreement. And insofar as they think they can get a good deal, they will strive for it. And those groups that are trying to block it will strive even harder. And I think that's what you're hearing, that as we get closer to agreement, the struggle is intensifying. But I'm pretty sure that if we get a good deal, there would be some effort, at least on the part of the Obama administration, to relax enforcement of some of the non-American sanctions.
Okay, we are quickly running out of time. Quickly, Mr. Marandi, if you can, would you say that what Iran's leader said then, I just mentioned, is going to be proven true? If an agreement is not reached, do you think that that means that the nuclear issue itself was not at all the issue? There was something else?
Yes, I think it's clear to many that that is the main point. But then again, the United States is facing great difficulty. It's facing economic crisis at home. It's facing a crisis of credibility across the globe because of the spying on even allies in Latin America. Leaders are outraged. It faces a crisis in this region as client regimes are collapsing. The United States needs Iran today more than it ever did before. In Syria now, we see that the United States is recognizing the foolishness of its policies over the past 2.5 years. So if the United States doesn't come to some sort of agreement with Iran, the United States will pay a heavy price. And for the United States to continue with the current policy, I think it's simply going to further weaken its own credibility. If it cannot, and if France really has a major difference with the United States, if the United States can't bring the French into line, then I think that even further reinforces the notion that the United States is quite weak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammad Marandi in Tehran, professor with the University of Tehran. I'd also like to thank our guest in Washington, Mr. Richard Weitz, the Director of Program Management at the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us here on The Debate. From me, Homa Lesgi, it's goodbye.